Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Teacher Effectiveness webinar on effective school leaders. I'm Elizabeth Greeniger, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Joining me as our featured presenter for today is Dr. Hanushek from Stanford University. Before I give you a more formal introduction into Rick, I would like to find out who's joining us on the webinar today. You should see a pop-up box come onto your screen, and I'd like you to select the role that best fits the one you serve. Nice to see a diverse audience with us today. Several principals are here. Lots of researchers. We think that everyone who's attending today will get a lot out of the session and hearing about the research that Rick has done on effective school leaders and get some real practical tips from the conversation with your colleagues on the line about how to use this information in your context. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hanushek. He is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His research spans areas such as the impact of teacher quality, high-stakes accountability, equity, and efficiency in school finance, class size reduction, and the role of cognitive skills in international growth and development. Rick pioneered the analysis for measuring teacher quality through growth and student achievement that forms the basis for current research into the value added of teachers in schools. He serves as the chairman of the executive committee for the Texas Schools Project at the University of Texas at Dallas, and he has authored or been the editor of at least 20 books and 200 articles. At this time, I'd like to welcome Rick.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me. The presentation today that I'm going to give comes from the standpoint of a researcher, and many of you have much more practical experience than I do. But from a researcher standpoint, I have spent many years looking at teacher quality and measuring teacher effectiveness and all the debates about evaluation and personnel systems, but had largely neglected the role of school leaders, at least in any of the research I'd done. There was, as all of you know, there's lots of anecdotal stories about the really good principal or the really bad principal, and there are movies about both. And I was never convinced that that was all that important in a systematic way, as opposed to a few isolated incidents of people that were really good. And then with some colleagues in Texas, I tried to look at the impact of principals on student outcomes and student performance, much the way that I had looked at the impact of teachers on student performance. And without wanting to hold the surprise for very long, the answer simply is that principals are really important in schools, and that there are big differences among principals, and it's something that's large enough that we should pay attention to. Now, I want to warn you before I give you the discussion of principals and their effects that I've spent so much time looking at teachers that I sometimes, instead of saying principals when I should, I say teachers. So unless I underscore it or something, you should always assume anytime I say teachers, I really meant principals. And so that's just my problem with getting the language right. So let me talk about today's activity, I want to review research on principals and effective school leaders. This research is all pretty new, at least in a systematic quantitative sense. There are lots of anecdotal stories and case studies, but this is an attempt to look quite broadly at the effects of principals. And I have done some of the work with my colleagues Greg Branch and Steve Rivkin in Texas. There are other people that will cite along the way that are doing similar work, but it's all within the last 5 years that people who have looked at quantitative research have looked at all at principles. Secondly, which I think that many of you are better able than I am to talk about how school leaders can influence school culture. That seems like much more of a question of what actually goes on within schools. But I will talk a little bit about what the research says on how effective school leaders impact on teacher quality. And necessarily that's going to be rather restricted because we're going to be able to look at how principals manage the teaching force, but not necessarily about how they make the existing teachers better. So those are the goals for today, to go through those. The specific questions that we're going to look at are the simple one that I've already given you the answer to. Is there substantial variation in principal effectiveness? What I'm going to try to do is show you how large that variation is. Does this difference in teacher principal effectiveness, see, I've already done it once, does this difference in principal effectiveness become more important in schools serving disadvantaged populations? Thirdly, do more effective teachers make better personnel decisions? And fourthly, I'll talk a little bit about the movement of principals that we see. Do they do good or bad principals, effective or ineffective principals, tend to leave poverty schools more frequently or not? So those are the questions that I hope to give you some answers to today, largely from the research that I've been doing across the state of Texas, but it's also backed up by other work in, particularly in Florida.
Great, Rick, thanks for that overview of today's webinar. We want to open up with a question for our audience and get a sense from folks of what you all think is the most important role of a good principal. So before we get started, we'll put out a poll and you can type in an open-ended response to that question. Instructional leadership seems to be the front runner here so far. Clearly, instruction is a central component of schools and really important for leaders to have some skill in providing instructional leadership to teachers. Leadership in general is coming up quite a bit, and I'm sure that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We'll get into a little bit of that today and kind of what the different skills that are necessary are. Talking about the impacts on student performance. Culture building. Rick already mentioned that that's something we'll be thinking about today. This is great. A lot of very broad concepts here, and I think, in the webinar today, you'll get some more specifics, but also I think, as Lauren already showed us, in the parking lot's a great place for you to exchange ideas and think about some more strategies and specifics of how school leadership looks in the place where you work. And I think that sharing of ideas will be really an important outcome for today's webinar. So feel free to use that parking lot to ask questions and to share any ideas as they come up through the conversation. All right, so Rick, I'm going to turn it back to you so you can give us some background on effective school leaders.
Oh. Well, the responses to that, I think, first show a lot of insight from your own experiences. They don't necessarily match survey evidence that I have seen on principles or time use studies, because the emphasis, at least originally, on instructional leadership is one component, but the surveys and the actual time use diaries of principals suggest that that's just one small part of many, many roles. I'm going to try to go into just the outcome effects first, and then we'll probably have to come back to the roles that principals have, but not necessarily from the research that we can do. The first sort of, I don't think it's actually necessary, motivational slide is that if you ask anybody in any kind of meeting about schools, they immediately say having a good leader or good principal is absolutely essential. And as I say, that's something that we have tried to look at in very detailed ways. The emphasis that we'll place is on the achievement of students, fitting in with the idea that this is the era of accountability, and the first thing that matters is whether students are learning and whether we can see the effect of learning. So what we're going to sort of the simplest conceptual model that we started with was just that principals can have quite varied impact on the school, decisions and influences on teacher retention, helping teachers to grow and do their job better, and setting the overall school culture were the background ideas that we had going into this study. But we saw this largely at this stage as rather a black box. And what we wanted to see is, if you put all those elements together, could you in fact find differences in student achievement gains? Now, to give you a lead-in to some of the evidence, I'm actually going to start with a study that is not by me or my colleagues. It's by actually one of my Stanford colleagues, Susanna Loeb, and some of her former students, who spent a lot of time looking at what happened in Miami-Dade County schools and serving different populations there. What it comes out across the board, and we'll reinforce this, is that principals in lower achieving schools or more disadvantaged schools tend to have less experience, less educational background. They're just newer to the job, and that happens rather systematically. As a result, you see that these new principals tend to turn over also more rapidly than more experienced teachers. And they're likely to have a big effect on who the teachers are and the teacher development. This comes from observational studies where these people actually spent a lot of time in the schools observing what the principal is doing and then trying to put that together with some of the data on schools. What they did find was that with less effective principals, that they tended to essentially drive teachers out, make them more likely to go to different schools and to other districts. That effective teachers had a big impact on student achievement within as short a time as 1 year, as did ineffective teachers have an almost immediate impact. And that was something that we didn't know before they started putting this together with the data on principal movements and on teacher movements and student achievement. The work that we've done goes on and tries to do it in a much broader scale. I guess I shouldn't have switched quite to that slide. What I'm going to do is show you not the study of one school district, but what I'm going to show you is what we see across the entire state of Texas, which, as you know, is one of our larger and more diverse states, so that we have lots of experience to draw upon. And I think it goes over to you, Elizabeth.
Yes, let's talk a little bit more to get folks engaged in this question. What impact do you all see principals having in your school, your district, or your state, wherever you're most closely familiar with? We'd like to know about the outcomes that you see principals having an effect on. So you'll see another poll, and we'd like to get this conversation started. And Kristen's comment in the parking lot, maybe you missed the comment Rick made at the beginning, but he mentioned that it's a frequent error he makes in interchanging the term teachers and principals because of heavy focus on work with teachers. So not intentional, but he did provide that disclaimer at the beginning. So just so folks are aware of that. So it looks like folks are seeing principals having a really big impact on the environment and the culture. Spending time with data and making decisions based on data. Setting expectations and vision. We know those are all important things. Rick, do you have the sense, just like with the last question, that some of the things that folks are mentioning here are the ones that principals are truly spending their time with? Or what is the research showing us, without going too much into what we talk about?
I think what the observational studies that go into schools show is that principals have the kinds of impacts that are shown here, but it doesn't necessarily match up to the way they're allocating their time and energy. So you see that some principals are doing many other things, you know, down to small administrative tasks and so forth, as opposed to really taking ownership for the culture in schools or making the system, the whole school work better. So the observational studies, I think, suggest that if these are the important things, which I believe that they are in general that are being listed here, if these are the important things, these are not the way all principals are spending their time, but they're doing quite different things.
And I think that begs the question, I think most folks on the call today would agree that if these are the outcomes that we want people to be spending their time there, we need to have some focused decision making about what expectations for principals are. So it's kind of some food for thought for folks. But good ideas here. We can move this along and get you into the next section to talk to us a little bit more about the details of the Texas Schools project and the study that was done there.
Well, let me, what I want to do is give you just a little bit of background about what this research that I've done is all about and how it's done. I'm not in any way trying to teach you the details or show you all what's involved, but I want to give you an overview so that you have some sense of what we can and cannot say with the data we have. The overall work is part of what we call the Texas Schools Project at UTD, or the University of Texas at Dallas. And UTD and the Texas Schools Project has worked together with the Texas Education Agency, which is their State Department of Education, to put together data that matches students and teachers and principals across time. And it uses the administrative data that many of you who are working in the schools are supplying to your state, but it tries to put it together in a way that we can use it for research purposes. What we have done is to examine principal quality and effectiveness from a value-added model, which looks at how does an individual principal add or subtract from the learning gains that you see in students. The whole idea behind this work, which in the background is a series of statistical analyses, the whole idea behind this work is to try to separate the role of the principal, or what difference a principal makes, from the other background factors of students and what they started the school knowing and so forth. So if you think that, as most research confirms, that families are perhaps the most important element of a student's learning, this research tries to separate the inputs of families from what does the principal add to the learning of the student. So since the mid-1960s, when this work really began, not the principal work, but work on looking at student achievement, we know that families are very important. We know that the other students in the school are very important. And then comes the schools, and the teachers and the leadership in the schools can have an influence on top of that. And so the whole research is to try to find out how important is it to know sort of which principal you had in a school, how important is it for the student outcomes. So that's where we're going with all of this. The way we do this is that we can actually put together all of the administrative data over a number of years, and what I've called it a stacked panel data. What it is that I can take an individual student in, say, 2000 and trace the path of that student from 2000 through 2005, 2010, and look at the achievement path and outcomes of that student. But I also then get to see some students in 2001 who start out in maybe fourth grade, and then I get to watch them as they progress through school. So it's a panel data in the sense that I follow individual students over time, and it's called stacked panel just because I look at different cohorts of students. The students of the class of 2014 or the class of 2013 or 2012. Now, the advantage of doing this work in Texas is that Texas is a huge state. And so we have a large number in our analysis here of different principals. We have 7,420 individual principals that we can observe for some period of time over the period 1995 to 2001. For technical reasons of getting access to the data, this is a little bit old, and we're right now expanding it right up to the current day, but I can't give you those results today. I just can give you the historical information. But we get to observe 28,000 principal and year observations and try to, out of that, say something about how different are the principles that we see. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at whether there are differences among high poverty schools or lower poverty schools, largely because much of today's policy discussion centers on whether we are helping our most disadvantaged students sufficiently, or what is it the schools that are holding them back, or is it something outside of the schools? If it's something outside of the schools, can the schools make up for the problems that poverty people in general have? So throughout this webinar, we're going to come back to poverty and disadvantage. So to get some starting point, we know that principals change schools a lot, and I'm sure that all of you have seen that in your own environments. What this chart does is give a little bit of data where we break out schools by their poverty quartile, and we have the lowest poverty quartile, which is the most advantaged students, compared to the highest poverty quartile, schools with the most concentrated incidence of poverty among the families of the students there. If you look at the first numerical column, what you see is that 17.8% of the principals in their are in the lowest quartile poverty schools are in their first year. They're just brand new. Slightly higher, 19.5%, are in their first year if it's a high poverty school. Similarly, the far right column shows you a sense of longevity. How many of the principals have been in these schools 6 or more years? And what you see is that principals tend to stay longer in low poverty schools and tend to go turn over more rapidly in high poverty schools. So this matches a lot of what the common perception is. The one thing I want to point out, though, is that you get much larger differences if I don't look at poverty per se, but I look at the overall achievement levels of the students in a school. And these just aren't the same thing. So if I do the same analysis where I divide schools up by the lowest quartile in terms of math achievement, and this is on the standardized Texas test of mathematics here we're using, and we divide schools by their average achievement in math, and the lowest math achievement, we find that over 20%, 22.7% of the principals are actually in their first year of teaching, and only 26% stick around for 6 or more years in low achieving schools, as compared to high performing schools where the students are high performing, the highest quartile in terms of math achievement of schools. Only 1/6 of the teachers are new to the school in their first year, and 38.8% have been there for a long time. So it looks like from these data that principals like to have schools with higher performing kids. Now, this is a little bit confusing in the following sense. I'm going to show you also that principals have a big effect on achievement. So it's not that they're just choosing to be in high-performing schools. They're having an influence about whether these schools are high or low-performing through their own actions. And that's what we hope to parcel out as we go along here. So let's go on to talk a little bit more about what the analysis is, because understanding the analysis is important. Many of the common first reactions to this work is, well, did you take into account the fact that some schools have kids that are less prepared than others and things like this? And what I want to do is walk you through a little bit of what we did to try to give you some idea of the things that we have taken into account. That's not to say that we've taken everything into account, but I'll try to show you what we have taken into account.
Rick, before you move into the section, just a quick question. You have a few folks asking, just a clarification, and I think you said it, but we want to make sure. When you're talking about principals in their first year, are you talking about first year ever as a principal or first year at that school in particular?
I'm talking about first year at that school in particular. And we'll look a little bit more at teacher tenure, but this is essentially a measure of how much turnover, how much churn is there in the principals of these schools, and is that churn related to either poverty or to the achievement of students.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. So what we're trying to do, this is a kind of a problem that researchers get heavily involved in because it's a complicated problem. It's not easy to pick out the separate impact of principals from all the other things that influence kids. We know that neither principals nor students are randomly assigned to schools. Parents are making choices about what schools they're in. Principals and school leadership, district personnel are making choices about what specific school an individual principal is in, and some of these things sort of go along all together so that we could get confused about, is it just that good kids selected into this school and it's nothing to do with the principal, or is it that the principal is having a big impact? So what we try to do, the main approach to try to take care of this is that we try to first control or allow for differences in all of the observed student characteristics and in their prior achievement. So when we look at a principal in, say, the year 2000, what we start with is, what was the achievement of the kids in that school in the year 1999? So we're going to try to ask, does the principal influence where we see student achievement at the end of the year or not? And so we're going to try to eliminate all of the differences in the preparation and then see what happens after that. And we're also, for the most part, going to try to standardize our results for how long the principal has been in the school, because a principal who has been in a school for a longer period of time obviously has a cumulative effect on what's been going on in the school. And so we're trying to look at people at essentially the same amount of time that they've been in the school to try to find out inherently how much difference is there in a principal. So those are the things that we're going to do in the background. I have, I'm going to walk you through or give you just a slightly technical version of this. Some of you are, in fact, interested in the technical aspects, and for the others, I'm going to try to introduce you to some language that you might hear or might see if you read any articles about the effects of principles or value added and so forth. I'll just give you a quick overview of that. What we're going to be doing is using statistical analyses to try to separate out the independent influences of all of these different factors. And in reality, when one does a statistical analysis, it's hard to say that you have absolutely the best way to perform this analysis. What we have done is use some alternative approaches that make different assumptions about the importance of other factors in order to get essentially a bound on the impact of teachers. We want to know sort of what's the largest and what's the smallest potential impact of principles. I said teachers again. Please translate whenever I say teachers, unless it's very specifically teachers, translate that to principles. What I want to do is use some alternative ways to look at the potential range of impact of principles. And if the lower part of that range is still a big number, which I'm going to show you it is, we can be pretty certain that no matter how we look at this problem, principles are important. And that's going to be one of the conclusions, of course. So let me provide you a brief technical description if I can. So we're going to use alternative approaches, and they all use a shorthand, a statistical shorthand, which is called fixed effects for principles. This is just researchers trying to mask very simple concepts. The fixed effect for principles is really the average impact on achievement gains of each principle. And so it has to do with the way it's estimated, which is unimportant for our discussion. What it really is I'm going to try to say, well, on average across all the kids in a school, what was the separate impact of a principle? And then I'm going to try to see whether that estimate of the average impact of the principle varies across individual principles. And of course it does. What this does is try to control for all the background that we can of the student, where they started, whether they were in special ed, whether they were ELL students and the like, things that are not the impact of the principle but of outside factors. And then I'm going to try to get the average effect of each principle, and then I'm going to compare these average effects across all of the principles that I see in Texas. There's a second way that this is done, which we will use as we go along, which is called fixed effects for principles in schools. What this says, what this really means is I'm going to look at the average effect of a principle, holding constant other things, but I'm just going to compare one principle in a school, in a given school, to another principal who comes into the same school. So I'm going to compare the effect of a principal at North High School or North Middle School with another principal in the same North Middle School in the same town. Now what this does is attempt to take into account the selection of both teachers, principals, and students into an individual school and say, well, if we look at all the kids that went to North Middle School this year compared to all the kids that went to North Middle School last year, they're roughly similar. There's not big changes over time for an individual student. And then I'm going to try to look at whether having a new principal changed the achievement and growth in that school. So this is a really stringent test of differences among principals because I'm just comparing two different principals in the same school and trying to say, did the first principal seem to do better than the second principal at that school where they're separated by a year or 2 years? Then finally, what I'm going to do is something I'm not even going to explain to you in detail. I'm going to try to look at how much of the variation in student achievement seems to be related to a principal and do that directly. So if I get a new principal in a school, it increases the average achievement of everybody in the school, what I'm going to see is that the variation in test scores across the state tends to rise a little bit because this new principal has managed to push up achievement compared to other schools. But I'll just give you the answers to that. The details are beyond any simple explanation in a webinar, but they're a really conservative way of trying to estimate the impact of principals. So this is going to actually give us our lower bound, the sort of lowest reasonable or plausible estimate of the impact of principals. And then what I'm going to ultimately do is try to validate the different estimates of the effects of principals by looking at what teacher turnover is related to an individual principal, so that if a principal has a big effect on a school, either plus or minus, we could plausibly expect to see that teachers are changing at the same time related to that principal. So that's the overview of what we're going to do. There are more details on this that I don't want to go into the details other than to say that the middle one is the most important, is that in all of the estimation we take into account what was the starting math score or lag math score of the kids that I observed this year, and as much of the student demographics as I can get from the administrative data: race, ethnicity, free lunch status, special education participation, gender, ELL, and so forth. And then I'm also going to try to allow for any changes in tests across the state and other things each year. So what I'm again trying to do is to hone in as best I can on what difference does it make which principal shows up in a school. So let me show you some results for that, if I can.
Rick, before you move on, one question that's related to the slide that you just were on. Francis is asking if you took a look at the rural versus urban, the context. So I don't see it there, but
we haven't spent a lot of detail on that, and that is actually on our research agenda to look at whether there are big differences. The only difference that we have is if there's differences in the racial concentration of schools and free lunch status and so forth, but we have not specifically allowed for urban-rural. We recognize that that's an important issue in Texas. There are 1,000 school districts in Texas, and about half of those are what you might call rural districts. And so we're going to come back to look at that, but I can't give you any specifics right now, Francis.
Great. Thank you for responding to that.
So here's uh, the first set of estimates of how different are schools. So what we've done here is to measure student achievement in standardized forms. So we've taken the Texas test and transformed them into ones that have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. What this does is allow me to say, how much does a principal move a student in terms of their position in the overall student distribution? Because we know, well, the following are characteristics of the student distribution. If I have a student at the mean of the distribution versus one that's one standard deviation ahead, the one standard deviation ahead is at the 84th percentile of the distribution. So we're moving students from the middle to the 84th percentile if we moved an entire standard deviation. Now that's a big number. I mean, it's something you see in most schools, of course, those kinds of differences, but you don't see schools that are that different, nor do you see the impact of principals. But what you do see is that on this slide, I've given you an overview of the average, the variations that we see in the average impacts of principals on student gains. It says the first 3 years of tenure. I just want to look at people in the same time period of being in the school, because a principal that's been there 15 years in the school has obviously changed a lot over that time, and I want to look at more a short period of time to see how much influence changing a principal has. And what you see in the lowest, let's look at the top line of this table at the bottom. It says the lowest poverty quartile. Again, this is dividing all the schools in Texas up by what percentage of free and reduced price lunch students there are in the school. And the lowest poverty quartile are the most advantaged students, or schools with the most advantaged students. And the impact there that's identified as 0.16 standard deviations of student achievement. Now what this says is if I take an average principal and compare them to a very good principal, one that's at the 84th percentile, in each year that we observe the principal, we see that students on average come out 0.16 standard deviations ahead. Now what does that mean? Well, that means if I started with a school with students at roughly the average achievement level, the 50th percentile, and moved them up 0.16 standard deviations of student achievement, I would move them up to somewhere around the 56th percentile of students. So this is each year. This is a big effect, because the good principal is actually moving kids quite a bit ahead each year, 6 percentiles in the distribution. But as big as that effect, it gets bigger as I go to higher poverty schools. So if I go down that column till I get to the greatest poverty, that's the most concentrated poverty schools, the difference between an average and this good principal is now up to 0.26 standard deviations, which means that I'm moving somebody from the middle of the distribution now up to the 60th percentile in the state distribution. So this is, again, a huge impact that we see estimated for the impact of principals. Now the opposite is also true, and we don't often like to talk about the opposite, but if I move, if I'm in a high poverty school and I move from an average principal to one at the 16th percentile of principals, at the bottom end of the distribution of principals, I subtract from student achievement, I lower student achievement, and I would move a school that started with the kids on average at the middle of the distribution, I would move them down to the 40th percentile in that next year. So what this is saying is that there are really, really big differences that we observe in student learning growth, gains in student achievement, depending upon whether they have a really good or really effective principal or whether they have quite a poor principal. On average, the impact is about 0.2 standard deviations, 0.21, which means that I'm moving kids from the 50th percentile of the distribution to the 58th percentile of the distribution. So that's the way that we try to characterize how much difference does it make which principal is in the school. Now, these are subject to lots of uncertainties, and I'm giving you precise sounding answers that say 0.21 standard deviations. The research itself, and something that's important when we think about policy, is in fact affected by different things. I put up on the slide random measurement error. It's just that the tests, as you all know, are not perfect. They do not perfectly measure student outcomes. And so we have to allow for the fact that, you know, some tests aren't very good or some students aren't prepared for a particular test. And we want to take that out of this problem. And so what this does is make principals look more different than they really are, because what we saw in the difference across schools and achievement gains was a combination of the impact of the principal plus this random error, this noise, this test measurement error that compounds, makes some principals look better than they really are and some look worse than they really are just because they got a good set of tests for a given year. Now there are formal ways to take care of this. I've just given you the formal treatment. It's Bayesian shrinkage estimator. What it really does is say that we want to sort of control for principles that look like they're far out in the distribution, have had too much influence, and we sort of move them back to the center and see whether that has an influence on achievement. Now there's a second set of problems that are particularly important for Texas at this time period. Texas in the time period that we're looking at was the late 90s, early 2000s, was using a particularly, I'll call it an easy test. It was a test that was designed to measure most carefully basic skills, the really fundamental skills, but not be too good at the top end. It wasn't very good at distinguishing students that knew a lot more than expected for a given grade. It was particularly good at looking right around the expectations, which were at this time fairly low in Texas. As you all know, there's a lot of debate nationally about the tests, whether some tests are too easy or hard. We're changing all of our tests and so forth. But it does, in fact, affect the research we're doing also. And the reason it affects the research is that we can tell a lot of difference with the Texas test at schools where many of the kids are low achievers. We have a more difficult time looking at schools where the kids are achieving more. The tests aren't very discriminating at the high end. So that means that if a principal comes into, well, I'll call it a low poverty school because on average they're higher achieving, they might have a hard time showing that they're really good because it just doesn't show up on the test because they're basic tests that are being given. So what we're going to do is actually sort of take all the students in the school and pretend that we have the same distribution of high and low achievers in all schools to start with, and then we can come back and see whether some of the variations we saw in principals, like we saw the lower variation in principals in the low poverty schools, if you remember. Part of that could be that they just have a hard time showing up on the test, that the low poverty schools are scoring high on the test and the tests aren't very discriminating. So we're going to try to make sure that the differences we saw across schools was a real difference and not just some artifact of the test. Now there's, again, I have no intention to teach you statistics, but what I want to do is to just suggest that we've spent a lot of time trying to take these factors into account. And the slide that I just put up at the bottom tries to show you that this isn't the driving force. These issues, these concerns aren't the dominant factors. The unadjusted column at the top is what I showed you before, that on average the difference between a good and an average teacher is 0.21 standard deviations of student achievement. When I allow for the fact that test measurement errors might come in, it doesn't change it much. It changes it from 0.21 to 0.20. It makes a little bigger difference when I allow for reweighting to allow for whether the tests are measuring performance at different points in the distribution well. And that makes a little bit bigger difference. But when I put it all together, the difference is 0.21 to 0.24 in the bottom column there. And we basically conclude that's not what's important. Our results are not some statistical artifact, but they are real. And Elizabeth?
Sure. Before I jump into this question, I think we have a relevant question from Nick. He's asking about the relevance of the standardized tests. For example, were they required for graduation, promotion, or included on transcripts? If you look at that, does that make any difference?
Very good question, Nick. The tests we're using are the standard state tests used for NCLB accountability purposes. They were actually, Texas started having test-based accountability before NCLB. I'm actually looking at the entire pre-NCLB period since NCLB came into effect in 2001. But actually in 2002 was when it really started. The students were not held responsible in some sense. So if students were not taking them seriously because it didn't affect their grades, that could enter into this. But what it does come into account for promotion. Texas was moving toward more grade retention at this time period, and so some of these tests came into play for promotion purposes, and other kinds of similar tests that we're looking at lower grades where we test lower and primary and middle grades, where we have the annual testing in math that we're concentrating on. There were other tests at later grades that did in fact affect graduation. So these were earlier in the career, were in part taking advantage of the fact that younger kids tend to take things more seriously than older, or tend to work on them more seriously. But there are the possibilities that in some schools the kids just blew it off and weren't paying attention to it.
Thanks for responding.
actually answer Andrew's question too. We're at a little bit of a juncture here. These are annual effects. These are one-year measures. These are the effects of a principal on the growth in student achievement over a one-year period. Now, we don't have particularly solid evidence on how these compound, but roughly these add up and go over time. So a principal has a continuing impact on the performance in a student, at least over the 3-year period that we're studying here. What we'll see is later on is that this impact actually looks like it continues as long as the principal is in the school, that they have the plus or minus impact.
Great. Thanks, Rick, for attending to those questions. I did note that there were some questions regarding incentives, and I want to get to that, but I want to open up this next question so folks can start responding, and then I'll get into some of the other questions that are happening in the parking lot. So for all of you out there, we'd like to open this one up and have you start thinking about what other factors in your schools or the research you might be doing could you see affecting estimates of principal quality. So other than some of the things we've been talking about, what do you see as having an impact on teacher or principal quality outcomes? While you all start typing that, Rick, I'm going to talk to you about some of the conversation that was happening back here, way back with David, and I think a few others regarding principal movement. So two kind of parts to this question came up in reference to monetary incentives. And so I don't know if you want to touch on this now, but I'll ask you and you can defer to later if you want to wait and talk about it in a little bit. They're wondering, is there a correlation between incentive pay for test score increases to principal turnover? So is there a relationship if principals are moving schools because of an incentive? So whether there's, I think, two situations. One is that there is an incentive to go to a high poverty school, or there might be kind of an informal incentive to go to a school that is high performing that might just have higher salaries in general. I think I'm understanding that conversation that was going on, but maybe if you could speak to that.
Well, we've tried to look some at salaries, and we're going to look more in the future. The difficulty is that we do not know, for example, what the contractual payments or salaries are for principals. And when we've looked at this in Texas, we find that it's often not even written down, but that it seems to be all over the board. What we found is that salaries to principals don't seem to be very closely related to how individual principals choose to move across schools or not. But this is looking at the level of principal salaries, and we cannot actually observe, or we haven't been able to yet observe, whether they, for example, get a bonus to move to a particularly difficult school or not. Those are questions we would hope to be able to look at in the future, but frankly, they're also really hard because most principals don't have set salary schedules, but in fact, it's much up to the superintendent and the district how they reward principals.
Okay, that's helpful information. I think that piece about incentives and compensation is a whole different topic, but certainly related. Let's get in here to the question that we just asked and start thinking about some of the responses folks are having. Give us a moment to glance through those. Andrew makes a good point about staffing and the principal's role in staffing schools. I think we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's an important role that principals play. Holly brings up the point of changing state and federal mandates, something I alluded to a little bit earlier, in reference to the principals having to meet a lot of varied requirements. So when we talk about our outcomes and some of the responses we got earlier related to communication and school culture and driving student achievement, sometimes those are not in line with the mandates that principals are under. So that certainly is a challenge.
Well, I should say that at least a portion of these observations that I think are all very important will be taken care of by where I'm going to take you in terms of a little bit more analysis of how much variation there is in student achievement.
That's great. So I think we can move right along. There will be some more opportunities for folks to weigh in, and feel free to continue to use the parking lot if you have questions or comments you want to share.
So let me return back to, again, some of the questions we've been asking, and also try to get at the ones that were just brought up, the factors of, is it the school board, is it state policies, is it the selection into schools and so forth that's driving part of this. And I'll try to give you some different views on that. The answer at this point is, yeah, there's a big difference in student outcomes that's related to the principal in the school, and that the variation in principal effectiveness looks like it's very large. Again, these are annual impacts. It's actually larger than 4 percentile. It's about 8 percentile difference. I think we've got a little mistake there from what we had before. This is the effect that is about the same size as has been estimated for teacher differences, except the principal works on the whole school, not just one individual classroom. So when we see these kinds of variations in student performance, and sort of try to compare it to, well, is a principal more or less important than a teacher? What we see is that in many ways the principal is more important because the principal affects the entire school all at once. So let's come back to both low-income schools, and it gets back to some of the questions that came up in the open response part. So couldn't part of this estimate have to do with just the kids that a principal happens to have in the school and the selection into the school? Couldn't it also be that the way the district leadership treats individual principals or schools? Isn't it something about the school board and so forth? We all know that politics and other things are really important in many of the decisions, particularly about who is going to be a principal and how long they stay and so forth. So this is where we go. I gave you an overview of alternative ways to try to estimate the impact of principals. The one that I gave you just sort of says, if I take into account all of the prior achievement of students and the characteristics of the students, what's the average relationship between, what's the average gains that we see in the school that's left over that appears to potentially be related to the principal? the alternative that is superior in a way, in the sense of trying to make sure that it's not other things influencing the impact of principles, is to go to what we said before, and we're going to look at principles within the same school and what happens to student achievement growth in a given school when the principal changes. So I'm going to compare the principal this year with the principal we had last year and say, how much difference do I see in the achievement growth this year and last year? And that's going to be my measure of the effectiveness of principles. Now, this is not, here is the way we're going to do that. The first column is basically what I gave you before of the effect of a principal by the poverty status of the school. The lowest, the highest in all means the poverty status of the school. And I've now, instead of just including principals in the first 3 years, I've included 6 years. But you see the same exact thing we saw before, slightly different numbers. But the lowest poverty schools, the most advantaged schools, have less impact of the principal on student achievement. 0.18 is that first number in that first column. And as the poverty goes up, principals seem to have a much larger impact on the growth in student achievement. Overall, the estimate here is 0.22 for now including this larger number of principals. Before I had 0.21, it's exactly the same number. Think of it as the same number. The right-hand column, though, is something quite different, and that's where I compare a principal this year with the principal last year and look at the differences in student achievement growth. Now, what this is doing is, unless we've had a change in the school board or a change in the politics this year to last year or so on, what I'm trying to do is look at a given school where all those things are roughly the same this year to last year, and the only thing that's different is the principal. And in this case, I get estimates that have the same pattern, but they're much smaller. They're roughly going to be about half of what I had before. What I'm seeing is that in the lowest poverty schools, the impact of a really good principal compared to an average principal is much smaller, 0.08 standard deviations. It's less than a half of what I had before. I have the same pattern that the principal looks to be more important as the school has higher concentrations of poverty. And on average, the estimate of the impact of principals is cut in about half. But let's think a minute again about the average effect, the 0.11 that I get here. This is a much more conservative estimate because it just looks at differences among consecutive principals on their learning growth of students. But it says that a good principal, again, at the 84th percentile, top principal, compared to an average principal, gets 0.11 standard deviations of achievement gain each year higher in the school. Now, I'm not sure if it was Andrew or somebody else who asked the question, well, if this accumulates, can't this close the achievement gap? And the answer is yes, because the average achievement gap between high poverty and low poverty students in Texas at this time was about 0.6 standard deviations. So it says if you have a really good principal for 5 years in a row or so, you can hope to close the achievement gap between this high poverty school and a lower poverty school. So these are, in fact, substantial impacts that principals have on the potential for closing achievement gaps. So that's the sort of more conservative, even in the more conservative estimates, we do in fact see a big impact. Now, we tried to look at what kind of impact a principal has on a school, and there we're restricted to the administrative data. So we don't have the depth and the color and the details that were brought up by your questions and comments early on. What we have is the administrative data, and what we can do is just look at transitions of principals and then try to figure out what's going on. What we've done throughout here is observe the difference in mathematics achievement gains across different principals, and they obviously have different cohorts. So we have looked at overall finding that a good principal compared to an average is roughly moving from the 50th to the 58th percentile, or a good principal to a very poor principal moves them from the 50th to the 42nd percentile. We've done some other estimates that try to validate this in other statistical methods, and I'm just going to give you the answers. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail, but what we call direct estimates in the far right-hand column only looks within schools, and it cuts the estimates again in half from the middle column. I think if you wanted to put a realistic bound on the impact of principals, you would say it was somewhere between the 0.11 in the middle column at the high end and 0.05 standard deviations of student achievement at the low end. But what I'm going to again just reiterate is that these are big effects because they are annual effects. They apply to the average for the entire school, so that they're going beyond individual classrooms, but saying how much difference does it make that you're in this school with this principal as opposed to this school with a different principal. This is where I turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Sure thing. So we'll take a breather for a minute and ask folks to think about this next question. So you've heard a lot about the study and how the researchers took a look at the poverty schools, and we were wondering what improvements do you think would be needed to increase principal effectiveness, especially in high poverty schools. So we'll open up a poll for that. And for any folks who are interested, we didn't put it in the resources box, but you'll see that Lauren posted a link in the parking lot, and that's a great article that summarizes some of the work he just described. So if you want to take a look at that, it's some great reading material. So moving back to the question, Rick, let's take a look at some of the responses there, ways folks are characterizing the improvements that could help increase principal effectiveness. Talking a bit about communication. I know a little while back in the parking lot there was some talk about engaging parents and different strategies to do that. Understanding the culture and the specific needs of the school community.
So I will give you a little bit of response to this, but in general, I think Andrew's characterization is correct, that what we've been doing is looking at a black box here. Something's happening in that box that leads to different principal performance, and many of the suggestions that are up above seem plausible to me. We don't have the research evidence, or I don't, to support which ones to pursue, but the overall answer of this research is we have to take this much more seriously. We just cannot let the leadership of schools be sort of float along without being actively involved, because it's having a huge impact, at least by our estimates, on where students are learning and how much they're learning.
And I think to piggyback off of that, Elizabeth makes a great point about the fact that there are just so many extraneous tasks that principals can become consumed with that take them away from the work that focuses on student achievement. So we've had a lot of people mentioning the buzzword of instructional leadership, but in looking at where principals really spend their time, it seems that their time is really divided and their focus has to be pulled in a lot of different directions. So
no, that's precisely the case. That's precisely what I was saying before, that the people who have done the research by going into the school buildings and finding out how principals spend their time and so forth find that they're distracted by all kinds of things that are quite different than instructional leadership or many of the items that are listed here.
So we'll give folks about 30 more seconds to write some responses there. And while they're doing that, Rick, there's a question over here in the parking lot from Renee. If you want to take a look at that, she's wondering about how students with behavior problems, oops, I lost it.
Oh, yeah, I've got it here.
Okay. I think essentially what she's asking is, how can effective principals support the situation where there may be schools with students with a high degree of behavior problems, no parent engagement or little parent engagement?
Right.
And how can a principal, how does a principal support that type of situation?
Well, when it gets down to how can a principal do it, it's actually getting beyond my research, and it's more into the realm of many of you who are actually out into the schools. What we found is that there's a larger variation in effectiveness of principals in low poverty schools. Now, that could be a reflection of the fact that there's just many bigger differences in the principals that are assigned to poverty schools, that some are really good and some are really bad, and that shows up in difference in student effectiveness. Alternatively, it could be that it's just that the job is so much more difficult or requires so much more in high poverty schools than in low poverty schools, so that if we had two sort of equally as good, equally as prepared principals, they would have very different effects in low and high poverty schools. Our research really can't differentiate that. All of our research is saying we see huge differences depending upon which principal is assigned to the school. The differences, I'm going to claim, are large enough that we ought to be thinking about the policies and the training and the background and the preparation and the mentoring and the decision-making on retention of principals much more than we do today, because these differences are so large that it looks like we're letting important issues of school performance slip by the wayside by not addressing them.
Thanks, Rick. I think that's helpful. As you stated up front, this goes well beyond, what your research looked at, and I think some of the practical solutions and conversations that are happening here in the webinar and that can continue to happen beyond today's webinar among colleagues really help to craft the solutions and think about, in reality and in each individual context, how to tackle some of these issues. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for folks to share some of your own strategies, more than what you've already been sharing. So we'll take this poll off and we'll continue on with the last portion of the webinar.
Well, the coming back to what we've seen in Texas, the data part of it, one of the things that we wanted to look at was how much principal turnover was related to poverty schools and whether the principal has an effect on teachers in addition to just moving themselves. And so one of the ways we looked at this was to look at teacher departures, and this is a very complicated diagram that I have for you, but what we're trying to do is to first, each of the blocks are quartiles of the poverty distribution of schools. So the upper left-hand quartile are the most advantaged schools, the ones with the lowest percentiles of poverty children, and down to the bottom right-hand column, which is the most disadvantaged schools. And then what we've done here are the rows in each box. So if we just concentrate on the most advantaged schools in the upper left-hand column, the rows are our rankings of the quality of principals based upon student achievement. From the bottom, the least qualified principals, to the top, which are the best, most effective principals. And what you see is in the schools with the poorest principals, the bottom of the distribution of principals, we get a lot of teachers who just disappear from the schools, and we get a lot more teachers that just change districts. So that the biggest difference is between the least effective principals and all the rest, but they're showing that teachers are both leaving teaching and leaving the school district much more frequently with poor quality principals. Now, if we go down to the most disadvantaged schools in the bottom right-hand column, we see some of the same differences that, again, the poorest principals have a harder time retaining teachers. We have more teachers that are changing districts and that are just leaving teaching altogether. So there's some direct relationship between the quality of the principal and what's going on with teachers. We actually also look at whether better principals lead to better teacher transitions. Not all teacher transitions are bad. If a principal makes a decision about removing an ineffective teacher, that's a good decision. If a principal makes a decision or causes an effective teacher to leave, that would be a bad one. What we see is that better principals, at least in Texas, seem to lead to the better kinds of teacher transitions. What we see is also that there's much more transition of teachers out of a school if in the grades where the students are performing the poorest. In other words, it looks like from the data that principals concentrate their attention, or good principals concentrate their attention on grades where there's achievement problems, and there they look to replace the teachers in grades that aren't working very well. So we've tried to put together all of this evidence about teacher turnover with performance in the schools. And do principals make better personnel decisions? Well, this evidence is a little bit limited, but the answer seems to be yes, that we're seeing principals, good principals, making better personnel decisions. The more effective principals replace a greater portion of teachers in grades where the gains. You've got to do the translation on my slides also, I'm sorry. But the more effective principals replace a greater portion of teachers in grades where the achievement gains are the less. And what we're seeing is that less effective teachers tend to leave schools where the principals are better. Now that's indirect evidence. We don't know who's making the decision. It could be that poor teachers realize that they're not up to the game and leave on their own account, or it could be that the principals are counseling them out or pushing them out in one way or another. But overall, what we see is that teacher transitions look better when we have a highly effective principal. So let me try to talk a little bit more about the interaction of poverty with this. What we see is that in terms of principal quality, that both the most and least effective principals tend to depart from the toughest schools, the more schools where the population is the most disadvantaged. So that the middle quality, middle effective principals are the ones that are more likely to stay in schools, particularly the disadvantaged schools. We do see in the lowest poverty schools that effective principals tend to be up to the challenge and tend to stay there most often in the low poverty schools. What we see if we look at where principals go when they move, we see a substantial number of the least effective principals actually just go to another school, which we think is potentially pointing to a poverty problem. If we have the dance of the lemons with respect to principals, it would not be particularly good for the overall system, that even if an ineffective principal leaves, they turn up someplace else. This is especially true in high poverty schools. And so we think that that's something that needs to be looked at more. We don't have enough detail here to know what's behind that, but it could well be that principals in a high poverty school that do badly are sort of given a second chance, sort of not being sure whether it's the principal or just a tough environment or what. But we do see that low effective principals in high poverty schools tend to go to other schools, and that worries us. So that's, the summary, I think, is pretty obvious. The research is hard to be precise about, but I've tried to give you a sense of where we're confident and where we aren't confident and what could influence the data. But what we're pretty sure about is that there really are big differences in principal quality, and that these differences at least have a bigger impact on high poverty schools where the challenges are most important to society is solving the problems of high poverty schools, and that principals are an element of this, and right now they're contributing potentially to some of the results we see. I've said this enough that I don't have to repeat that we think that the impact of principals is very large. Let me just end this portion by telling you where we're going with this work. We're actually working quite a bit on this right now. As we speak, my co-authors are working on this whole problem of getting more precise and more detailed answers. What we're doing is going from our 7 years of data that we had for this study to 18 years of data, which gives us enough detail that we can look at a large number of the questions about just what are the transitions of principals and where are they going, how does the career path of a principal unfold as we look at it. And we also are going to look a lot more detail at the role of salaries that was brought up earlier, and of the accountability system and whether that's having an influence, positive or negative, on the movement of principals. What we can do is look at the Texas ratings of schools and how that interacts with the mobility of principals. Then there's some other details of looking at how the impact of a principal evolves over time when that principal has a longer tenure within the individual school. So those are the places we're going to go. To us, this is research that points to an important issue, but it leaves lots of open questions, as we've seen in the parking lot, where people have great questions that we hope to be able to answer somewhat, but many of these questions are actually going to be answered by you participants in the webinar who are closer to making some of the decisions and the policies that are important with school leaders.
Thanks, Rick. Before I move on to the next poll, there's two questions that relate somewhat back to the discussion you were just having over here in the parking lot. Andrew's asking if you simulated or modeled the pattern of teacher departure to estimate what share of the observed impact could be explained by differential teacher departure.
We don't have that right now. We do, the way we've done this is by looking across different grades in a school and whether principals are making better decisions across different grades. What we hope to do in some of our work is to go into much more detail about precisely which teachers are leaving by essentially estimating the value added of individual teachers and looking at how movement of teachers with different value added or different effectiveness move with different teachers. But we haven't been able to do that yet. It turns out that takes a lot more data, and we're just in the process of being able to look at questions like that.
And Stephen asks a question that I think my hunch is that you haven't studied it, but I'm going to pose it so that you can share any insight on this question. Whether you were able to study your study to show the impact of an effective principal on improving the poor teacher to becoming a better teacher. So we know you talked about movement of teachers out of schools, in or out, but how about just improvement in growth in a teacher? Do we
that's an excellent question. I mean, that's basically one of the things we want to look at. I answered the prior question by saying that we wanted to look at the value added of teachers that move or stay with different principals. One of the things we also would like to look at is whether the value added of teachers changes according to whether they have a good or bad principal. And we haven't been able to do that yet. That takes this much more detailed information about precisely who the teachers are and what the impact of each teacher is, in addition to who the principal is. And we're trying to crack that problem, but it really takes a lot of data to do that.
Okay, and one more question here from Liz before we move on. She's wondering, what are your thoughts on using school-level value added as a measure of principal effectiveness as opposed to using a model that calculates principal fixed effects?
Well, this is getting at the same kind of issues, but it's we haven't had enough time to try to sort out different ways of estimating these. The principal fixed effects look a lot like school-level value added during the tenure of the principal, during the spell of the principal. But we haven't solved some of the details of estimation that you're bringing up. And I'd be happy to talk to you offline about that, Liz, because that's getting beyond what I suspect most of the audience wants to get into.
Great, and we'll share Rick's contact information at the end of the webinar so that folks, if they have more specific questions, can reach out. So at this time, let's move on to the next question, and we'll be interested in finding out from all of you what patterns of principal mobility have you seen in your research or in your state or district. So has it mirrored what we've discussed today that his team has seen in Texas, or have you seen different patterns? And Rick, while folks are answering that question, we did receive some questions prior to today's webinar that folks sent in, and one of those is pretty simple to answer, but I'm hoping you can share with folks what standards they can refer to that qualify school leaders as effective. So describing the standards for school leadership.
This research borders some on that, but what we've been unable to do is to pinpoint background or preparation of principals that relates to their effectiveness. This research on principals looks a lot like the research on teachers. In the teacher work, what we find is that effectiveness is largely unrelated to the degree levels of teachers, mostly the experience, at least past the first couple of years of teacher experience, but their professional development and their certification and so forth. And that's been a pretty strong finding in the teacher research. To the extent that we've looked at that so far, principals look exactly the same. Some people are really good at it and some people aren't good at it, but it is not very closely related to the background and preparation of the principal. And so to the extent that standards means what do you want a principal to look like before they can be a principal, I don't think that we have any good answer to that. In fact, our answer is a little bit to the negative in that the simple things that we've looked at about background in terms of preparation and so forth don't seem to be very related to effectiveness. So that suggests that you would not want to use those things as the standards for what a principal should look like. If you think of standards in terms of outcomes and effectiveness, I think that this research is probably too crude to give you actual measures. So you wouldn't want to write into the Texas State Education Code that you can't be a principal unless your fixed effect is 0.05 standard deviations or something like that, because we're just not at that point to use any of these measures in terms of the direct evaluations. What it does point to is that decision-making about principals should be more strongly related to student outcomes and student performance, and that's what you should pay attention to.
That's really helpful. One thing I know, and just guiding folks, and many leaders on this call probably are aware of the ISLIC standards as a practical guide for school leaders and a standard that they can shoot for. I think Lauren just put that link up there, so kind of characterizes some of the description you just gave us. And so let's move over here to the poll question and take a look at some of the responses there, what folks are seeing in terms of principal mobility in their areas. So Holly's noting that in Maine they're seeing a lot of mobility among their high poverty schools. Kelly talks about...
I'm sort of looking at Kevin's question, which is the last on there, that suggests that paying attention to value additive teachers may in fact be just putting too much stress on them and demoralizing them. Exactly how you use quantitative assessments of teachers or other evaluations, I think is still an open question for both teachers and principals. I think the evidence suggests that the impacts of principals and teachers are large enough that you want to pay attention to who are really effective and who are really ineffective. But we obviously have to be careful of how we incorporate that in an evaluation system and in making career decisions about teachers and principals.
A couple folks are commenting about some of the more effective principals moving from the low-performing schools either into higher-performing schools or out of schools in general. And that's something we see with teachers as well. So this exodus from the teaching profession because of a lot of the things that we're already discussing.
No, absolutely. That corresponds also to the data that we put up right at the very beginning of this presentation, which shows that in high poverty schools are much more likely to, high poverty schools are more likely to have new teachers and more turnover, but low achieving schools are really almost an extreme, that low achieving schools have lots more principal turnover and principal exodus. And that is consistent with the fact that principals are looking to move to districts that have higher achievement and are doing better. And that's something that we actually have to deal with is from a policy standpoint. We have to find ways to ensure that highly effective principals and highly effective teachers are in fact willing and able to perform in our most disadvantaged schools.
One question I want to raise, but I don't think we have really time to get into it. Both Andrew and David talk a little bit about some non-public schools, so maybe your charter or your independent schools, and the success of principals in those settings. And I'd be curious to what the research shows. It's clear yours focused on public schools in Texas, but you may be able to point people into a direction to learn more about that.
So our data will include charter schools in Texas as other public schools. We haven't separately isolated them and looked at them in terms of either leadership or in terms of teacher movements. We have been doing other work on charter schools in Texas right now, and it's not publicly available yet, but what we've seen in Texas is that the charter schools have in fact improved over the last decade noticeably. We tried to get at part of this by actually surveying individual charter schools and to talk to them about what they thought was most important in changes over the last 10 years. And in virtually every survey we conducted, or each interview we conducted, somebody mentioned at one point or another that leadership is important, and that they, in fact, in the charter school sector, appear to spend more time both screening and developing leaders for their schools than appears to be the case in the traditional public schools.
Well, the 5 o'clock hour is creeping right up on us here on the East Coast, and so we're going to move right along. We have just a few more slides and then one more final question for folks. Try to wrap up so people get out of here in under 2 hours. We have some general conclusions. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these 2 slides because Rick has already really gone into the summary and kind of what the bottom line is here. It's clear that leaders matter. We've talked about that from beginning to end in today's webinar, and we need to spend some time focusing on principal evaluation and rewards, take a look at credentialing and how that relates to performance, again linking back to standards in our recent discussion of that, and to do some more research on the development of principal training and mentoring. Another summary of some of the things we've been talking about. And so now we really want to ask you all what you gained from today's webinar and what you intend to take away back to your context, your school, your district, your research setting, and your answers could really help others in thinking about how they could take action that's meaningful. I'll mention a few things as folks are typing, just so we can get through all the housekeeping type things at the end of the webinar. We have the PowerPoint down below for you to download. You'll be receiving an email in the next couple of days that asks you to take our survey. If you don't take it today, I will provide the link for you in just a minute. If you feel that this is a webinar that you'd like to share with others who may not have been able to attend today, you'll have a link to the archived webinar, and you can feel free to share that with others. And you will see in just a slide or two Rick's contact information as well as mine. If you have questions for either of us, Rick more on the topic of effective school leaders, and if you have general questions on the REL webinar series, you can feel free to reach out to me. We hope you'll plan to attend some of our upcoming webinars. You'll see in one of the upcoming slides dates and information on those webinars, both the teacher effectiveness and our Ask an Expert series. And I'll shift back to taking a look at some of these responses. Looks like across roles, folks are going to share the information with either their principals or with principals that they work with. Rick, do you have any final thoughts or comments on the takeaways that folks had?
Support your good principal and get rid of your bad principals.
Easier said than done, right?
No doubt about it. I mean, I say that easily from the standpoint of a researcher, but at the same time, I think it's something that we have to start having a serious dialogue about of how we do this.
Well, at this time, we're out of time for today. Thank you all for the great engagement. I'd like to give a virtual round of applause to Rick for his time and his effort in sharing his expertise and knowledge on this topic. As I mentioned, I'll advance to the slide where you can see his information. Here is the way you can get in touch with him or with me, or any general questions about the work the REL Mid-Atlantic does. And we have a forum on teacher effectiveness, which you can continue the dialogue. As I mentioned, here are our upcoming webinars. We hope to see many of you back for one of these events. And you should see the evaluation has opened in a browser on your screen, and we'd love you to take that feedback survey so that we can continue to improve our webinar series and meet your needs. And thank you all. We hope you have a great night.
Thanks everybody for attending.